Hey, so in this lecture, we're going to try to go through, we're going to do more than try. We're going to successfully, positive thinking, we're going to successfully get through the way in which the U.S. enters World War One, because understanding that is important in being able to explain how the war comes to an end. And where we're going to start is by remembering back to 2 weeks ago when we were talking about the main causes of World War One. Let's go ahead and think about a naval arms race. So, in the lead up to World War One, we saw a naval arms race develop between Germany and Britain, where, if you can remember the key term, I'll give you 3, 2, 1. That's right, the two-power standard. We see Britain trying to build 2 ships for every ship that Germany is able to develop in an effort to make sure that Britain has the strongest navy. And when war develops, neither of them stop in their ship development. And so we see Britain really successful based on that 2-power standard in dominating totally on the water. And this leads to a bit of a problem because, as we see in this photo here, there's a blockade of British battleships that is preventing Germany from gaining access to any of its resources in its colonies or accessing any sort of global trade, which is a problem not just for the military effort, not just for like the industrialization of weapons and new machinery, but also for the civilians, because they're not able to trade for food and resources that they need in order for their people to eat. And so Germany really has to figure out some way to break the British blockade. And they do in what they develop, which are underwater boats or submarines. And so once Germany develops an effective submarine that can fire a torpedo, these U-boats, shortened for underwater boat, they're really great at sinking British ships. And it takes Britain a while to develop a strategy to effectively counter the U-boat. And so for a while, there's a pretty aggressive battle within the North Sea. So early on in the war, Britain sets up a blockade of battleships we saw in that photo. And this blockade ends up really preventing a lot of trade, which because of total war, the preventing of food getting to a people was seen as acceptable because those people, because of total war, probably had a job that was somehow connected to the war effort. And the less of them to eat, the less of them survived, and the less of them to build, weapons and technologies and help the war effort. And so Britain was doing a pretty severe tactic where it was preventing a lot of food from getting back to Germany, and the people of Germany by the end of the war are going to be dealing with mass starvation. But it was seen as fair within the war because they're protecting their own in doing so. And Germany, after a couple months of this blockade and not being able to break it, they're faced with a choice. That choice is to give up and accept defeat, or to determine to sink every British ship in the blockade. If you were Germany in the first year of World War One, what would you do? Yeah, they go for sinking every single ship in the blockade. And we see Germany develop a tactic called unrestricted submarine warfare. Unrestricted submarine warfare is exactly what it sounds like. It's unrestricted. And so what Germany announces to the world is that any ship that sails too close to Britain, whether it be a merchant ship or a military ship, Germany's going to sink it. And so Germany starts attacking and sinking trading ships as well as the British battleships. This comes to a head with the sinking of the RMS Lusitania. So the RMS Lusitania is a cruise ship. Keep in mind that at this point, if you wanted to travel across the Atlantic, your only real option for travel, because there are no commercial airplanes, is through cruise ships. And so a lot of people used them, and they were a lot more common than they are today. And so the Germany sinking the RMS Lusitania, like right now, like, can you imagine if, like, because the RMS Lusitania is a cruise ship, it's like basically like a Disney cruise boat. Can you imagine if like Germany sank a Disney cruise ship? How would people respond to the attacking of a Disney cruise ship? Like, it'd be pretty extreme, right? Except for that, Germany had intelligence that said that that Disney cruise ship, aside from being full of families, was also full of weapons being sent from the US to Britain. Because while the US has remained neutral in the war, they haven't said no to making a profit. And so the US has used its military ability to not aid one country over the other, but they're definitely selling weapons to one side of the war and not the other. And so Germany finds out that the Lusitania is filled with weapons, and rather than let those weapons get to Britain so that they can be used against the German soldiers, the Germans use torpedoes and their submarines to sink the cruise ship just off the coast of Ireland, where the waters are really, really cold. American citizens hear this news of the sinking of a cruise ship and the death of 130-something American citizens, and they're pissed. They get real mad. They can't believe that Germany would be such a monster as to attack a Disney cruise, or not Disney cruise ship, but to attack a cruise ship. And while Germany publishes announcements saying that, you know, there were weapons on the ship, nobody really believed them because this had been a part of their unrestricted submarine warfare. And this was the moment where, like, Germany was just going to be the big bad villain. 1,200 people end up dying, a lot of them just because they can't get pulled out of the water fast enough and the temperature is too cold. For reference, you could watch the movie Titanic and watch a lady not share a very large door in which she could have definitely saved 2 people's lives but didn't. But the Titanic, to give you an idea of cruise ships in this time period, was the fanciest cruise ship of 1912. And here we are in 1915 with the sinking of the Lusitania. 128 of those 1,200 people are Americans, which, all told, not a huge amount, but still 128 Americans dying in a war that they're not a part of, because they were on a cruise ship trying to go on a vacation is pretty aggressive. We see a lot of American outrage, letters to the editor, just a lot of public opinion that says this is unacceptable. The world ends up responding in a pretty big way. We see not just Americans outraged, but a lot of British colonies and British former colonies getting really frustrated. So we see, like, Canada as well as Australia and New Zealand weighing in on this, and everyone's pretty aligned in that Germany's really the bad guys here. And this leads, before we totally walk away from it, years later, when a bunch of archaeologists end up excavating the RMS Lusitania, they discover that the ship itself was actually laden with a healthy amount of munitions, not just bullets, but guns as well. And that the US and British governments, who had handily denied putting weapons on a cruise ship, had totally lied to the public, and that Germany's intelligence of the fact that there were bullets on the ship was absolutely right. But it's war. And so we see, after the sinking of the Lusitania, a pretty large dilemma grow within the American public opinion. This war isn't happening anywhere near our shores, and while it's happening with countries that we have a relationship with, America at this point was pretty isolationist. It wasn't really concerned with the problems of the world because we had enough of our own problems. We didn't need to go out fighting everybody else's. And so we see Americans, after the sinking of the Lusitania, kind of fall into 2 camps. The first are known as the Hawks. These are the Americans who are fully supporting going to war, and oftentimes it was because they viewed the attack on the Lusitania as being unforgivable and an action that absolutely warranted a response. You wouldn't be surprised to find that many of the people who supported the idea of going to war had close ties to people in Britain or France, as well as this unrestricted submarine warfare sank merchant vessels and military vessels. We see American ships also being caught in the crossfire of this war. And so in an effort to protect Americans' trade with, like, you know, its colonies like the Philippines, we see people argue that we need to go to war in order to keep the seas safe, even like beyond helping the allies over there. Like, just for our own interests, we have a reason to get involved. Here we have two pieces of propaganda. Here we have a sleeping Lady Liberty and an announcement to wake up. Civilization calls every man, woman, and child. This other one is Remember the Lusitania, where you can see that we find that the said deceased died from their prolonged immersion and exhaustion in the sea 8 miles south-southwest of the old head of Kinsale on Friday, May 7th, 1915, owing to the sinking of the RMS Lusitania by torpedo without warning from a German submarine. That this appalling crime was contrary to international law and all convention of civilized nations, and we therefore charge the officers of said submarine and the Emperor and government of Germany, under whose orders they acted, with the crime of willful and wholesale murder. Before the tribunal of the civilized world, it is your duty to take up the sword of justice to avenge this devil's work. Enlist today. And we see a lot of Americans start pushing, the advent of Uncle Sam, the I Want You guy. That comes from this time period. And we see after the RMS Lusitania sinks, there are lines outside of military enlistment offices all across the country as people so mad and ready to do something end up joining the military in hopes that the U.S. will go to war and they'll have an opportunity to kind of avenge the Americans who are lost and, defeat those evil Germans. That's not every American, though. We also have a pretty divided group of people. So if we have those who want to go to war, the Hawks, the ones who want to stay out of it are known as the Doves. Oftentimes, they either took a isolationist viewpoint where that's not our problem, why would we get involved in it? Or they had close ties to Germany. There had been a huge wave of German immigration in the late 1800s to the U.S., so many Americans were either first or second generation German Americans, and they thought going to war would be really complicated for them, especially because the U.S. would be attacking Germany, which means that there's the potential for German Americans to end up fighting their European family. And so, but the biggest cause, or the biggest reason that we hear from the Doves is that it's just, there's too many people who are going to die. So we have protests, as you can see here in the Capitol building, people lining up outside the buildings to advocate for staying out of the war. There's a lot of music at this time where the music itself is politicized in nature, and so I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier becomes a popular tune. Not quite as popular as Over There, which is the pro-war song. It's still pretty catchy. If you want to pause and go listen to Over There, I'll wait. Okay. We see propaganda labeling the desire to go to war as war hysteria that tramples on the civil liberties that our country stands for. And then we have political cartoons showing that after the war, maybe they'll get a medal, maybe a job, but really illustrating the human cost of the war. And today's, I don't know when today is for you, but in this week's activity, one of the things you're going to do is read a speech from President Wilson just a few days after the sinking of the Lusitania. So right now, let's go ahead and take a guess. What do you think the American president is going to say? What would you expect him to say? You'll go ahead and find out if you're right later. We're going to go ahead and pause, and you can answer this on your own. But at this point, do you think the U.S. should enter the war or stay out of it? The Lusitania has sunk. 120 Americans are dead. People are dying along the Western and Eastern Front. The U.S. could do something about it. Do you think the U.S. should? What actually ends up bringing the U.S. into the war may or may not be the Zimmerman telegram. We're going to talk about it like it is. Then you're going to read Wilson's speech and another senator, Senator Norris's response to Wilson's speech, and you can form your own opinion as to whether the Zimmerman telegram is really the main cause of the U.S. getting into the war. But a lot of historians are going to point to this as the inciting incident that gets the U.S. To declare war. So on January 16th, 1917, the German Foreign Secretary, Arthur Zimmermann, sends a telegram to the German ambassador in Mexico. And in this telegram, he says that we shall endeavor, in spite of this, to keep the United States of America neutral. In the event of this not succeeding, we make Mexico a proposal of an alliance on the following basis: make war together, make peace together, generous financial support, and an understanding on our part that Mexico is reconquering their lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Germany offers Mexico financial and technological support as long as Mexico declares war on the U.S. Why would Germany want Mexico to fight the U.S.? How does that benefit them? Another thing that's in this letter from Zimmerman to Eckart is the fact that Germany soon plans to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. After the sinking of the Lusitania and a couple of other civilian ships sinking, Germany had stopped using unrestricted submarine warfare, but by 1917, there's not winning the war, there's a stalemate, and they're starting to get desperate. And so in this letter, or this telegram, Zimmerman lets Eckart know that Germany is about to restart up unrestricted submarine warfare, and that they're worried that by starting up unrestricted submarine warfare, that it's going to bring the U.S. back into the war, and they're worried that the U.S. might not stay neutral. And if the U.S. joins the war, Germany wants to make sure that the U.S. is preoccupied and isn't able to just send soldiers and support over to the Western Front. And so they're offering an alliance with Mexico as long as Mexico is willing to declare war on the U.S. Zimmerman has to send the telegram through U.S. cables, because the telegrams, they're not sent through satellites, they're sent through cables, and these cables are run across the entire Atlantic. It's called the transatlantic cable, and those are super expensive and really hard to repair, and Britain had sabotaged Germany's transatlantic cable, and the U.S., as a neutral power, had offered to Germany to send any of their messages along as long as they told them where they needed them to go, and that they were just normal diplomatic messages that had nothing to do with, like, I don't know, them trying to get Mexico to declare war on them. I don't think the U.S. would let Germany use its telegraph wires if it knew that Germany was trying to get Mexico to start a war with them. That might be a message that the U.S. would want to lose. So if it's the U.S.'s telegraph wire, why doesn't the U.S. know what the message is? And the simple answer is because it was in code. And the message ends up having to go from the U.S. Embassy in Germany to Copenhagen to London, where British intelligence intercepts the message and is able to crack the code and find out what the message actually says. And so from London, it gets passed all the way to the German embassy in D.C., where then it gets sent down to Mexico City, and Secretary Eckart is able to take the message to the Mexican government. When the message gets intercepted in Britain by Room 40, which is this room of mathematicians and code breakers who were able to decode multiple secret messages, multiple secret codes that the German military tried to use in order to send messages. They end up decoding the message 2 days before it gets to DC. And they read it and they find out that Germany's dumb enough to try to get Mexico to declare war on the U.S. Because what do you think the U.S.'s response is going to be when it finds out that Germany's trying to declare war or trying to get Mexico to declare war on them? Do you think the U.S. would rather be fighting along its own southern border or sending soldiers overseas? Where would you like the fighting to happen? In your own country or somewhere over there? And so they hold on to the message for a couple of weeks because in part they think that the unrestricted submarine warfare is actually going to bring the U.S. back into the war. But when the U.S. remains neutral despite Germany reassuming its unrestricted submarine warfare, they end up giving the message to the U.S. government. So why do you think Britain made sure that the U.S. got this message? Okay. Well, actually, when Nigel de Grey, who's the guy who actually decoded the message himself, when he found it and read what it understood, he ran to his supervisor and asked him, "Do you want to bring America into the war?" The British government was so confident that this would be the thing that brought the US into the war that the only thing they really had to conceal was how they found out about the message. Because let's take a moment. How did they find out about the message? Oh, because they were listening in on whose telegraph wires? The Americans' telegraph wires? Huh. So Britain goes through this elaborate scheme to conceal that the message was actually decoded in London by claiming that they intercepted the message all the way down in Mexico, and tried really hard to hide the fact that this was something that happened in London. So real quickly, why do you think that Britain is reluctant to admit that they had intercepted the message in London? What are they trying to hide from the US? Yeah, they're absolutely trying to hide the fact that even though they say that they're friends, and even though they say that they're, soon to be allies, I mean, Britain's asked the US to be allies a couple of times. What is Britain doing? Secretly listening in on all of the US's communications, especially the US communications coming out of Germany. Why would Britain be eager to find out what the US and Germany are talking about? What is Britain so afraid of? Why doesn't Britain want the US to know that Britain's listening to their conversations with Germany? Right? So on March 1st, 1917, President Wilson, after receiving the telegraph, gives it to the newspapers, and it gets published in all of the newspapers across the country. And people read it. And then people fall into one of two camps. They either think that it's totally fake, that this is something that Britain is just making up. And why do you think some Americans were willing to believe that Britain would make up this message that Germany wants Mexico to declare war on the US? And the others look at it as real and say, well, this is the last straw on us staying neutral. Of course we have to go to war. It's either we go to war over there, or we're going to end up with fighting another war with Mexico here. And so on March 3rd, Zimmerman ends up publicly admitting that he wrote the telegram. And the American citizens who were convinced that this was some British plot, all of a sudden have confirmation that Zimmerman's really the one who wrote it, that this actually came from the German government, that this message is real. And so Mexico, just so you're aware, had already, by the time that it's discovered that Zimmerman really wrote the message and it's sent to the public, Mexico's already declined the offer. They're like, yeah, Germany, you could pay us. We're not going to start another war with the US. That sounds like a you problem. We're just going to hang out over here. So we're going to pause, and you're going to reflect on a couple things here. One, personally, at this point, it's early 1917. We're in March. Do you think the US should enter the war or stay out of it? And then thinking back to your opinion on whether the US should get into the war after the sinking of the Lusitania, did your opinion change? On April 3rd, the US officially ends their neutral negotiations. They dissolve their diplomatic ties with Germany. On April 6th, Congress officially declares war, as well on Germany as well as the rest of the Central Powers. You can see here that it was a vote of 373 to 50, which means the vast majority of the House was in favor of the U.S. going to war. And you're going to read later this week two speeches, one from this man here, Woodrow Wilson, and his speech to Congress asking them to declare war, because that's a power that the president doesn't have, but Congress does. And then you're going to read a speech from Senator Norris, who spoke as a response to Wilson's speech, where he says, maybe our reasons for going to war aren't as noble as we might believe. But at this point, Norris's passionate argument for us staying out is outvoted, and the U.S. gets involved in the war. So when the U.S. sends their soldiers, it takes them a couple months to get their soldiers ready and across the Atlantic. But what advantages do you think the U.S. soldiers are going to bring to the Allies? Think about it. We're 1917. The war's begun in 1914. Britain and France and all of the allies fighting on the Western Front have been fighting for years. They're exhausted. They've seen so much death and destruction. And then these American soldiers show up all oorah and ready to fight and like happy and healthy, except for those who are coming out of Kansas and bringing the Spanish flu. We're going to come back to that later because there's a fort in Kansas where an outbreak of the Spanish flu has begun, and those soldiers get on a bunch of ships, and then they go to the Western Front, and then they spread the flu across the Western Front. So now it's not just artillery and guns and gas and enemies and fleas and rats. It's also disease. So the trenches are great. And then American soldiers show up with new supplies, a new attitude, and we see a second wind. That's it. That's where we're going to end this.